So welcome to our first question and answer session. Thank you for all of the questions, which are excellent. And so each week I'll try to answer, 4 or 5 questions that were asked in a slightly more comprehensive fashion, maybe because they're particularly interesting or because a lot of people were asking them. So this is the first question from this week's lecture snippets, which is the policy of salutary neglect and sending the dissidents overseas to new colonies seems a little short-sighted indeed. Did the British just not think that colonists were already leaning towards free thinking wouldn't be a problem in the future? And the key here, I think, was the structure of the British government in a couple of different respects. The first of all is that there was no, strictly colonial secretary in Britain until the late 1760s, and instead, the colonies were run within the British cabinet. The agency that had jurisdiction over them was this agency called the Secretary of State for the Southern Department, but this position had jurisdiction also over southern England, over Wales, a small section in the western part of the UK, over Ireland, which at this point is a British colony, over aspects of British maritime policy, and over the North American colonies. And as you can see also, this is a chart of some of the secretaries of state for the Southern Department in the late 1600s, early 1700s. This was a department that had lots and lots of turnover. So if you're an ambitious British politician, first of all, you're likely not going to be in this office for a very long time. And secondly, if you are, you have a whole bunch of different priorities. You might be focused on, southern England. Maybe you have land in Ireland that you're interested in. Maybe you're particularly concerned with Wales. What's going on in the British colonies is like priority number 22 for most of these people. And in addition, again, they're having very, very quick turnover. So even if you are a figure who might be interested in ensuring that the Navigation Act is implemented, or that there might need to be some long-term thought about the situation, policy towards the colonies, you're probably going to be out of office by the time all of this is resolved. So, in terms of thinking about this question, absolutely, this, in theory, this is a real problem. You send your dissidents overseas and to an area that's nominally British, but even less under British control, then the risk is quite substantial that they're going to seek even greater autonomy. But for most of these people, that would be a concern for their successor. They had a short-term problem, which is they wanted to get the dissidents out of Britain. They didn't really think very much about the long-term problem. Now, the British will almost entirely restructure their government in the aftermath of the Revolutionary War in terms of how they treat colonial affairs. And one of the things you'll see from the British in the 18th and 19th century, 19th and 20th centuries, and for those of you who've done European history courses, you probably encountered as Britain has a quite robust colonial department with civil servants who are there a very long time. They kind of think broadly about how Britain is going to approach its colonial empire, which by this point, of course, has expanded, well beyond. Canada was still a British colony, but places in the Caribbean, in Africa, in India, in Southeast Asia. But that degree of thought and long-term analysis didn't exist during the revolutionary period, and so the result was this system of historians call salutary neglect, in which technically the colonies were under the authority of the crown, but in reality, from the late 1600s until 1763, they were functionally autonomous. So by the time the British try to reinforce their authority after 1763, there's no one in the colonies who's still alive who remembers a situation in which the British were actively running things. One other point on this period, which I should have mentioned in the original discussion, the British also were very cheap in terms of how they structured their colonial empire. And so every colony in North America had a colonial governor, but the colonial governor was not was not paid by the British Crown. Instead, they were paid by the colony. And so basically, if you're appointed a governor, your job was to negotiate with the colonial assembly to make sure the colonial assembly would pay your salary. So this was great for the British because they could send their civil servants over to the colonies and it doesn't cost them any money. But the effect of this was it made the colonial governors particularly dependent on these colonial assemblies. And the colonial assemblies, remember, were elected by the colonists. Because if you're a governor who really causes a lot of problems, the colonial assembly will just cut off your salary, and then it's a less than appealing situation. So even the political figures whose job was to represent the crown in the 18th century colonies were compromised by the fact that they had their own particular interests and their own need to get along with the colonists. Second question dealt with the structure of the Articles of Confederation. So these were a couple of different questions. The first was wanting to know why I call this a curious government, the Articles of Confederation, and the second about whether there were any ideas in the Articles of Confederation that were carried over into the Constitution. These are somewhat related. In terms of why I called it a curious government, the Articles system is unlike any system of government which exists today in any democratic country, not just in the United States, in that it was an entirely legislative government. So if you think of the current U.S. government, we have three branches of government: executive, the president; the legislature, Congress, which in turn is divided into two separate branches; and the Supreme Court. And the thinking of the Constitution, we'll be talking about this a lot throughout the course, is the idea that the branches balance each other. If you have three branches, they're all competing for power. It makes it harder for any of them to be to become examples of tyranny. The Articles system, by contrast, has only one branch, the Congress, the Continental Congress, which is simultaneously functioning as both an executive and a legislature, and even to a certain extent, I guess, a judiciary, although there's really no national judiciary during this period at all. So try to think of the current Congress, just the current House, say, simultaneously being a legislature or and the president. It's a very sort of weird structure, and historians of the Articles, have debated whether we all should consider the Articles to be primarily a legislative body or primarily an executive body. So they seem like a legislative body, and it's called the Continental Congress. Every state has representation in this kind of strange fashion in which more populous states get more individual legislators, but each state only has one vote. So every state is wholly equal in terms of the structure. That's something that seems to us like a legislature. But by the same token, the Continental Congress performs functions that we associate with an executive. There are cabinet secretaries that come from the Continental Congress. So today, for instance, think of the Secretary of State or the Secretary of Treasury. These are clearly executive department functions. Congress does not have a Secretary of the Treasury. And simultaneously, the Continental Congress makes war decisions, functioning in what we would now call a commander-in-chief power, which again we associate with an executive. So this was, I think, a weird government in that it had both executive and legislative components, and then within the legislature had this really unusual approach of representation in which larger states got more delegates, but at the end of the day, every state had the same amount of power. For the most part, this is a governmental structure which does not survive the Articles. And indeed, the failures of the Articles, which we'll be talking about this week in the lecture snippets, are very much on the mind of the framers of the Constitution. But there are critical ways in which the Articles do set the framework. And maybe the most important, and this came up in a couple of the questions people asked about the Northwest Ordinance, is that the Articles system establishes a principle in which federal territories, that is, portions of the United States that are not at the time part of an individual state, that federal territories are under the control of the national government, not under the control of the state governments. And that was something that was by no means inevitable. It was very easy to imagine a different approach where the states were alternatively claiming different state lands. So that principle, which then gets implemented in the Northwest Ordinance, which says that once states admitted from these new territories will have equal power, it allows for the expansion of the United States across the continent in a constitutional fashion to ensure that these newer states will have equal power to the original states, which is something that basically had no precedent in the 18th century world. So that was one important aspect of the Articles system, which does postdate the Articles and plays an important role in the development of the Constitution. So several questions about rotten boroughs and this issue of representation. So first one of why would the British have had to rezone in order to give the colonies representation? The issue of rotten boroughs and pocket boroughs, and does this ever reemerge in the post-colonial America? And then what exactly made a rotten borough? So several related questions. The first is, what is a rotten borough? Rotten borough and pocket borough are essentially interchangeable terms, and the one I mentioned in the one of the ones that I mentioned in the lecture snippets was this one. This is a photograph of Dunwich. So this was evidently a thriving early Middle Ages commercial port, and so when the House of Commons, the lower house of the British legislature, begins to come into form, or begin, the districts begin to be drawn in a more modern way, in the 1200s and 1300s, it's natural for Dunwich to get a seat in the House of Commons, and then you can kind of see the erosion here. A good portion of the town just vanishes into the sea, and there are very few people left by the 1700s, and the result is that in these kinds of systems, the crown or local commercial interests basically get to dictate who gets to be the member. So that's essentially a rotten borough. A shorty definition of a rotten borough is an existing legislative boundary which elects members to Parliament, but no longer has any robust population at all, and therefore the crown or some other interest essentially dictates who gets represented. In terms of whether this ever reemerges in post-colonial America in some way, shape, or form, the answer to that question is yes, and it's a good one. Keep it in the back of your minds. We will see this emerge vociferously in voting rights issues in the 20th century, and there are a number of states who create their state legislatures on the basis of like equal representation in terms of counties, and so you'll get counties that have a tiny number of people in one county and hundreds of thousands of people in another county, and they'll get the same representation. And then secondly, one of the key problems with rotten boroughs is that Britain never redraws its district lines at any point in the late Middle Ages. They don't do it until 1832. So basically you get a system that is frozen in place on the basis of an earlier population, and this, as we will see, happens in the American South in the first half of the 20th century. As to the second part of these questions, which is, remember that the colonists, especially Benjamin Franklin, was the one who pushed this argument. We're saying, look, you have a 600-person House of Commons. Give us 50 representatives. Give us 25 representatives. Say that every colony gets 2 members of Parliament. That will ensure that we nominally have representation. It won't meaningfully affect the composition of the British Parliament. What could go wrong? That makes perfect sense. And indeed, in isolation, it would have. The problem with this is that in the 18th century, and again, those of you who know British or European history know, this is the origins of the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain. And one of the demographic effects of the Industrial Revolution is the dramatic expansion of population in large cities. Manchester, big industrial town in the northern part of Britain. You can see this here from London, which pops up from 200,000 people in 1600 to more than 1 million people by 1800. But again, the British system doesn't redraw its lines, and so even though London is much more populous over this 200-year period, it doesn't get any more representation in Parliament. And there's a lot of debate about this in Britain. A lot of these newer towns, Manchester is a great example, because it had almost no people before the Industrial Revolution. Suddenly now, it's tens of thousands, like I think 75,000 people live in Manchester by the 1700s, and they have basically no representation in Parliament. And when these British forces make this argument, the defenders of the status quo in Britain say, you don't need representation in Parliament because you're virtually represented. All members of Parliament are out to defend the liberties of British citizens, whether they're from Manchester or whether they're from Dunwich. And so whether Manchester or Dunwich gets to elect a member of Parliament, doesn't matter. Now, this, of course, is an absurd argument when you think about it. So if the British had made a concession to the colonies and had told the colonies, look, we understand what you're saying, we appreciate it, and we agree with you that you should have actual representation in Parliament, that virtual representation can't apply for you. If that concession had been made politically, that would have knocked down the entire house of cards. If Boston is entitled to actual representation, or New York City is entitled to actual representation in the British Parliament, how then could Manchester or Liverpool not be entitled to actual representation, or London be entitled to more representation than it had? So because of the defenders of the rotten borough structure of Parliament, which was the unreformed Parliament, had come to rely on the virtual representation argument to argue against reapportionment of British parliamentary boundaries. They basically were stuck with that argument to resist the colonies. Ultimately, it will be 1832 that Parliament will there's finally enough pressure, and they agree to redrawing the district lines. And one of the reasons why the census is put in the U.S. constitutional requirement for a census every 10 years and an adjustment of district lines on that basis is that colonists remember this debate about actual versus virtual representation, and the framers of the Constitution want to avoid a rotten boroughs-like system in the United States. And then the last question of whether there were any movements to persuade Rhode Island to agree, or were there reasons for abstaining from amending their articles? No. The thing about Rhode Island, that they were not they were not covert about what they were doing. So you had this very odd system. Rhode Island is this quirky colony. It's a tiny colony, nestled between Massachusetts and Connecticut. It is originally settled by dissidents from Puritan era Massachusetts. So it sees itself as kind of a rival to Massachusetts. It relies very heavily on commercial trade, especially through Providence and Newport, which are major ports during this period. But it's not a tremendously wealthy colony. It undertakes huge debts during the Revolutionary War, and so after the war, the state government of Rhode Island comes up with this idea, and these photographs of actual Rhode Island currency from the time. They come up with an idea of printing paper currency. And there is no national currency in the Articles of Confederation period. Each state is supposed to do their own currency, and most of the states, although they did have paper currency, they were supposed to operate under the premise that if you had a note for $2 in paper currency, say from Pennsylvania, you could go into a bank in Philadelphia or to the city government in Philadelphia, and they'd be required to give you $2 in gold. It's still kind of a metallic-based currency currency system. But Rhode Island doesn't adhere to these principles, and as a result of this, there was an assumption that, if you were a resident of New York doing business in Boston, it would be acceptable to pay for your goods and services with paper currency from Pennsylvania, because the assumption is that all of this currency would be good. And the Rhode Island approach is, we're just going to print the currency, and even though we don't really necessarily have it backed by any gold or silver. And what Rhode Island recognized, the 1780s government of Rhode Island recognized, was that it was very likely that while the Articles of Confederation government lacked the power to tell a state government to stop doing stuff like this, if there were significant reforms of the Articles that gave the national government more power, it's very likely that Rhode Island would no longer have this option. And so they would have to pay their debts by taxing their citizens rather than by printing paper currency. So Rhode Island's arguments in defense of the Articles, against reforming the Articles to the Constitution, are entirely self-centered. And they are what they are, and everyone knows this. And as we'll see in the snippets next time, Rhode Island does not send any delegates to the Constitutional Convention. They initially sort of try to ignore the Constitution, and ultimately the Constitution is ratified despite them, and then they figure out they better join. So the issue here is that this kind of relates to the earlier question about the curious structure of the Articles system, a system in which one state, no matter how small and how peculiarly governed, can block any effort at significant structural reform, is a system of government which is unlikely going to be able to adapt and to last very long. And that's basically what we see with the Articles. So that's answers to some of the questions from this time, which again were excellent. So thank you for them, and hope everything is going well for everyone. Otherwise, that people are staying safe, and I will talk to you soon.